Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Jack Cafferty. This is CNN Hotline. For the next couple of hours, we'll give you the opportunity to talk to the experts and to our CNN correspondents in the field about the events of the last 5 days. The telephone number to call is a toll-free one. It's 800-310-4CNN. Aviation security and terrorism, the hotline topics of the moment, as you might expect. Over the next couple of hours, we will talk to Mary Schiavo, who left the FAA and has some rather harsh things to say about that agency. She's a former Department of Transportation Inspector General, and she wrote a best-selling book about the shortcomings of the airline industry called Flying Blind, Flying Safe. Also, terrorism expert Harvey Kushner, who has written a book called The Future of Terrorism, plus senior political analyst Jeff Greenfield, and all of our correspondents in the field. We have them at Ground Zero at an armory here in the city for the families of the victims, as well as in Washington, D.C. First, let's get all the latest news up to the minute on the investigation of the World Trade Center bombings from Pentagon and the Pentagon tragedies from our senior correspondent, Gary Cutley. Gary.
Thanks, Jack. Well, as we know, there's now a second person being held as a material witness in connection with Tuesday's attacks. The man had been held by U.S. immigration authorities, and he has been questioned by the FBI. The first material witness, that's someone who has believed to know something important about a crime, was arrested on Thursday. Every military operation has to have a name, it seems, and there's none yet for the war on terrorism, whatever that's going to be. But there is now for the military's current domestic effort following the attacks. It's being called Operation Noble Eagle. Like father, like son, President Bush's father went to Camp David to make his key decisions leading to the Gulf War 10 years ago. Now George W. Bush is there. Saturday he said, "We're at war," and he labeled Osama bin Laden as suspect number one on his list for the attacks on Tuesday. And in New York City, the digging, the searching, the hoping continues. But on Saturday, as on Friday, as on Thursday, no survivors were found. The number of people believed to be buried under that mountain of rubble has now been raised to nearly 5,000. Only 159 bodies have been recovered, and 187 people are missing and believed dead at the Pentagon site. And now, 4 days after the attacks, the funerals are beginning in New York City and elsewhere. Mourners gathered Saturday at the funerals of 3 top New York City Fire Department officials. There may be some 300 services for firefighters alone. Fire Department Chief Peter Gonsi, Department Chaplain Father Michael Judge, and First Deputy Fire Commissioner William Feehan all lost their lives on Tuesday while trying to carry out their rescue missions there. A lot more of that to come, unfortunately. A growing question now, of course, is when and how will the United States respond to the attacks? President Bush does not want to be held to any specific timetable. His officials Saturday are putting out the word saying that it will be a long-term struggle. Here's our David Ensor.
An angry and determined president is promising action.
We will find those who did it. We will smoke them out of their holes.
But if Osama bin Laden is the culprit, revenge against him or against his hosts, the Afghan Taliban government, will not be easy. Cruise missiles fired in 1998 missed bin Laden and may only have strengthened his image. Even if bin Laden is killed, many analysts say that would not stop terrorism by his followers.
I would want to destroy as much of bin Laden as possible. I'm simply saying that's like picking a wart off your neck or something. That doesn't do much. That's a very superficial blow against this kind of capability.
To get rid of one man or to launch any kind of revenge attack isn't going to help. Revenge alone is not an answer. There has to be a complete eradication and elimination of all the training camps.
But bombing alone would not likely achieve that. And there are indications those terrorist training camps in Afghanistan are today largely empty. Much of bin Laden's support is across the border in Pakistan, in the area around Peshawar. One reason the promise by Pakistani President Musharraf to help the U.S. against the terrorists could be crucial.
I especially want to thank the President and people of Pakistan for the support that they have offered and their willingness to assist us in whatever might be required in that part of the world as we determine who these perpetrators are.
But can Musharraf convince his military and intelligence services to stop their long and active support for the Taliban?
Pakistan is supplying fuel funding, infrastructure, training, arms, and administrative help to the Taliban. Without the Pakistani lifeline, the Taliban would not survive.
Senior administration officials warn none of this is going to be easy or quick, and that the United States cannot do it alone. It could, in fact, take years, analysts say, of political, economic, and military effort before Americans can overcome their newfound fear of mass terrorism on U.S. soil.
We're talking about a war, and it's a campaign. And in a campaign, there are going to be a lot of battles. We're going to win some of these battles. We're going to lose some of these battles. There are going to be more civilian casualties on both sides. More Americans will die.
Before it is over, many analysts say it could even require U.S. ground troops in the region. For now, though, the main focus of the Bush team is diplomatic, building a strong international coalition, much as the president's father did before the Gulf War. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
There is, however, Jack, one major difference between now and 10 years ago. George Bush Sr. then had a very carefully, narrowly defined goal focused to hold that coalition together. This time, as we all know, and as the President acknowledges, it's a much broader agenda out there. So many targets you're looking at, it's going to be much more difficult to hold a coalition or alliance together.
And not only Osama bin Laden's group, but there are other terrorist groups. Bin Laden's active in 55 different countries, including the United States. Some of the people that are suspected in these crimes against the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were living right here in the United States, going to flight school, learning how to fly these planes. So it's a much more far-reaching and probably tougher to define objective.
Much more difficult because there's no singular Saddam Hussein out there. Yeah. It's a network. Yeah. And how many heads do you have to cut off?
You've covered a few stories back down the road. You and I worked together over at NBC a few years back. What do you do with this story? Where do you rank it? How do you
this is the top.
Put this in the file?
I started my journalistic career, I think at 23, as an office assistant for NBC a week or two before JFK was assassinated. And in terms of impact, hitting the nation, this is up at that category.
Where were you? How did you find out about it?
I was in Brussels as an office assistant. It was the evening, and I got a phone call in my apartment from the wife of John Chancellor, the former NBC correspondent anchorman who was there. He was off on assignment, and she said, "Have you heard? The president has been shot." And I said, "They don't do that anymore." And she said, "Oh, yes, they have."
All right. Gary, you'll be back with us throughout the program. News updates, keep us up to the minute on the latest developments. Also with us this evening, as I mentioned, terrorism expert and author of Terrorism in the Future of Terrorism, Harvey Kushner, and our senior CNN political correspondent, Jeff Greenfield. Jeff, you've had 5 days to cover this story. The emotions of day one are not the emotions or the feelings of day two. What's getting your attention now? Where are you focused?
How much more serious this is, I think, than anything in my lifetime. We lost a president. We mourned for 4 days. We had a new president. When I remember Lyndon Johnson bringing in the heads of state, it was very solemn. It was a very big signal that the government was going to go on. It affected people for years to come. You can argue it was a watershed moment, but there was no danger to the United States. The Vietnam War was ugly, divisive, tore the country apart in many ways, but it never put the United States physically at risk. And the Gulf War, as Garrick said, while it was serious and it was a big moment, as it turned out, blessedly, I think if it weren't for one lucky Scud hit, the deaths would have been in a few dozen.
Yeah, it was clean, and it was surgical, and it was short.
We knew where the enemy was. We knew what the goal was. Yeah. Saddam Hussein was not only a perfect villain, he had done a clearly villainous deed that threatened diplomatically, geopolitical interests, but did not threaten us, I mean, in the physical way. So you add up, you put these things on the table. Everything we thought about the world that we were going to be living in and that our kids were going to be living in has been put at least at risk. Mm-hmm. The thing that we never thought could happen, a massive, deadly assault here at home, which never happened in World War II. I mean, we see pictures of blackout curtains and air raid wardens walking through towns to make sure that there were no lights. The Japanese were not coming over here with their airplanes. I think there was a group of saboteurs, German saboteurs, that landed a submarine off Long Island. They were captured. They were executed within 6 weeks. We were not at risk in that sense. It was clear where the risk was. The risk was where your sons or fathers or husbands were over there, as the song had.
Right.
So when you put that on the table, and then, as I'm sure Harvey will get into with you, start talking about how you even define what the mission is.
Yeah.
Where is it? What constitutes victory? I mean, the hardest question I know how to ask about all this is how will we know when we've won? So I not only think it ranks at the top in terms of story and effect, I think it's the most difficult situation this country's found itself in my lifetime.
In a couple of minutes, I want to ask you a question about whether or not we have the national resolve necessary to do the kind of nebulous, long-term, expensive things that are being talked about in Washington. Life's been good since the end of the Gulf War. The economy boomed. The Cold War ended. The Gulf War was won. And this nation has been not only at peace, but kind of living high on the hog. And all of a sudden, it changes just like that. And you wonder now whether we have the patience. We tend to be an impatient country. The strength, the intestinal fortitude. So think about that for a minute. Judy's on the phone from Connecticut. Judy, what do you want to bring up with us this evening? Are you there, Judy?
Hello, you there?
Hello. Yes, I'm here.
My comment is, do we have a government who is intelligent enough to do this now, do you think? What's your comment?
You don't want to know my comment. I'm just kind of here to preside over this thing. I don't know. I don't know if it's just a question that's fair to address to the government. I don't know if anybody's intelligent enough. I mean, we talk about going after terrorism. What does that mean? And where is it? And who is it? I mean, they're living here. They're living in 55 other nations. They're supported by state governments. What about that question?
Well, I'm just thinking of the questions you raised because of the title of David Halberstam's book on the men who led us to war in Vietnam. The Best and the Brightest. It was an ironic title. It was a title meant to convey his profound sense of disappointment and anger and even rage at the quality of the decisions. Those men were celebrated in Life magazine article by Theodore White, the man who wrote The Making of the President, as the action intellectuals. And then it turned out that these people, as smart as they were and as educated as they were, clearly some of those decisions were not the right ones. I think this question is on everybody's mind right now, even though when you look at them on paper, Colin Powell, Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, these are experienced folks. But what's the resume to fight a war like this?
And the parallel on Vietnam is not lost. We were fighting an enemy we didn't understand, we couldn't find, we didn't know exactly who they were. They were soldiers, they were women, they were kids, they were carts full of vegetables that have been booby-trapped. We didn't know how to go into those jungles and fight. And there are parallels, I suppose, with the kind of thing we're about to undertake here. Lauren in Florida, what's your question?
I just want to say that, I'm a native New Yorker, and I lost, right now, 2 cousins of mine are missing. And my husband and I, we both work for American.
We lost her. She said that she had 2 cousins that were missing. I think she was saying that she and her husband both work for American Airlines. The impact on the airlines, obviously, coming as a result of this is not insignificant. Continental has announced it's going to lay off 12,000 people. Midway Airlines suspending operations. I think 1,700 people are going to be out of work. And the cost estimates on money lost per day, something in the neighborhood of $250 to $300 million. One of our guests that we'll have on here in a couple of minutes, I heard her earlier in an interview talking about the fact that she wouldn't buy a ticket. She wouldn't get on an airplane now.
The other question you have to put on the table is the whole notion of locking the barn door, after the horses escaped. Yeah. You understand fully the impulse to ratchet up security in the airlines, but as far as I can tell, none of the steps that have been taken would have stopped any of these hijackings. So, and you know that when you impose these levels of bureaucratic and logistical demands on an already overtaxed system, what you're going to get, and it may be a price we'll have to pay, is going to be massive. It's not just the inconvenience. It's not just having to check in 2 or 3 hours early. Right. But it's also what that's going to do to an already economically depressed airline. And then the question is, at what benefit in terms of security? Last night I had on a fellow who'd lived in Israel 30 years, a writer named Zev Chaffetz, who worked for the Begin government. He said, do you really think that if the terrorists plan to strike again, they're going to do the same thing they did before?
Of course.
So that's where you begin to ask yourself, But what point are these steps, which are taken out of security, out of caution, out of fear? It's not just a question of what's it going to do to us, but what are we going to get from it? And I actually think when you ask the question about patience and resolve, one of the real questions is going to be, when you add up all the costs of this, human and financial and logistical and burdensome, I don't know how you calculate it. I don't know how you do that. It's way more than money, and it's even more, it's, believe it or not, than 5,000 lives. The ripple effect of this, I think, is going to ultimately wind up affecting millions of people.
Is this a doable thing we're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. But if I may, just for a moment, for almost myself, since it's happened, commenting, worldwide and answering questions, it's had a traumatic shock on my body. But hearing the discussion when you opened up, Jack, mentioning what events, in your past, in lifetime, were monumental, and each one mentioned certainly the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And but you're in the business to look at the news and to pick out and report to the general public. But somebody like myself, who spent his entire life almost studying just this day, this possibility, and then to see it happen, it's my greatest fears were visited. And so, unfortunately, I don't wish this upon America, but we were coming into an age where each one of you and everybody out there is going to have to think about it and give the thought that I have over 35 years in this business of studying the terrorist mindset and seeing what happened on the 11th. And that's the type of effort that's going to have to be launched in these United States. I consider myself a sane person. I consider myself able to focus in on what I love in the United States, our Constitution and our freedom of access, but yet my life is spent looking at just this possibility, and I think I'm traumatized by it, but I think if we all put our effort to it, sort of a Marshall Plan or a monumental approach to taking a look at what's going to happen, then we're going to solve it. If we're going to take the approach that was hinted before, this singular effort, this one-shot deal, firing some missiles in and then walking away from it, it's going to be over with, because the front is not just going to be outside the United States, gentlemen, but the front will be inside the United States. We're going to have a fifth column of subversive acts occurring here.
Like Jerusalem with the car bombings and the...
Absolutely, that's the kind
daily
that's
occurrence.
The next stage. I mean, Jeff mentioned it. Osama bin Laden himself has never considered the same thing twice. He's always ratcheted it up. So the next thing might be somebody in Penn Station with 40 pounds of explosives pressing that button. Because make no mistake about it, you can't pull off a monumental effort like this unless you have support. Osama's not sitting in the Batcave in Afghanistan on his cell phone saying, you do this, you do that. Yep. His adherents are out here with a message beyond what he's already told them.
All right, we're going to get to Dave in California who's on the phone. Jeff, I know you've got a long day, and you've got Greenfield at large to look over, and you've got demands placed on you by other CNN programs. I thank you for helping us launch this, and I look forward to talking to you again on this program soon. Jeff Greenfield. Dave, in California, what can we do for you?
Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I actually had two questions. One is first about the military response, and then if I can, a second one about immigration. But I'm a 32.
Well, let's start with the military response question.
Okay, military response question. I'm a 32-year-old father of two here in California. My grandfathers fought in World War II. In fact, one was a B-17 pilot in Europe. You folks have mentioned the question about, do we have the intestinal fortitude for this? But yesterday I saw an interview with Norman Schwarzkopf about, and this question has been raised about ground troops. And I think the American people need to prepare themselves for the question of that this is going to take years. But here's my question. I've only heard phrases on the news of, well, U.S. hasn't ruled out any options. I'd like to hear from the experts if they think that if this does drag out years, would we consider, you've shown pictures in the last 10 minutes, bin Laden is literally and figuratively maybe under a rock. And would we consider the use of tactical battlefield nuclear weapons to end this in lieu of losing 50,000 United States and coalition and British and French and German forces? Because we better start talking about it now, because the question might arise 2 or 3 years from now. That's my question.
Well, it's a good question I'm not capable of answering. I suppose the question on top of the question is whether even in the case of someone who has dug into the degree that he apparently is, whether even tactical nuclear weapons would be effective. I mean, there is a school of thought that says the only way you get this guy is to go in and dig him out, get him out by hand. The other part of the story is, as the reading I've done, he's surrounded with people who are instructed to make him a martyr rather than allow him to be taken alive, so that in the event that the security around him is penetrated, his people have instructions to put a bullet in his head so that he becomes a martyr for the Islamic fundamentalists. But what about the question of nuclear weapons? And while we're on the subject, a country very much involved in this is Pakistan, and they have nuclear weapons.
Well, certainly at this stage, nothing's off the table. I mean, if you take the president literally smoking them out of their holes, that's what you would do with, with nuclear weapons. But there are geopolitical considerations that need to be discussed. First of all, you have the concept of Iran is in the area, and certainly Pakistan, and realize that when you launch a nuclear attack, you launch it against the world, you launch it against the atmosphere, and I don't know whether or not American citizens, certainly environmentalists, you don't want to get them up on something like this. So I think it would be serious to use a tactical nuclear weapon. I think there are other ways of dealing with this rather than the ultimate. That seems to me something that these people would think of using. And certainly Osama already thinks of himself as a dead man walking. He knows his life is numbered. So that's not a way to win this type of war.
What was the other question, Dave? You still there? All right, Calvin in Texas.
Yes, sir. I was just wondering, the FBI most wanted done so good and everything else. Why can't we put their pictures and their faces up on the TV so we will know who they are? To where, like in Florida, they didn't know who they were, but the CIA and FBI were looking for them, but yet, we didn't know.
I'm
Why
not
can't
sure.
we put their picture up on the TV?
Calvin, I'm not sure that the identifications of these, if you're talking about the hijackers, I think those identifications were made after the fact, if the reading I've done is accurate. And prior to the event, we didn't know who they were. We obviously didn't know the event was even going to take place. But within a matter of hours, because apparently they left a trail that was fairly easy to follow, knowing that they were going to die in this thing, they did have IDs, and the names and the pictures were published shortly thereafter. I'm not sure they would have been able to publish the pictures of the people who did the crime before they knew the crime was going to happen, if you get my drift.
And Osama's picture is the most publicized in the world the last couple of years, and there's $5 million on his head, and he's #1 in the world. I don't think that that's going to do any good in this particular instance at all.
All right, why don't we bring our other guest into this, who is a woman who has had some very harsh things to say about the airline industry in this country. Mary Schiavo is a former Inspector General of the Department of Transportation. She has written a best-selling book entitled, and I had it written here, where is it? Flying Blind, Flying Safe. She joins us this evening from Columbus, Ohio. Mary, nice to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
If you got a call that you had to be in California in the next couple of days, would you go to the airport, buy a ticket, and get on a plane tonight to go?
No, already got that call and said no.
Why?
Well, because we had a rush to get everything, quote, back to normal, and the response has been very piecemeal. And Mr. Greenfield was absolutely right. The trouble is we've rushed to put in these stopgap measures. Many of these things we've done, we've tried before. It's piecemeal. We have the same security screeners that already allowed the breach, the breaches in the past. And this is kind of too little, too late. We're doing the same old thing, and the threat is much greater than that now. One of the things, for example, the FAA had many different terrorist scenarios on the table that they were worried about, and many of those aren't covered by the current security plan. So really, with the piecemeal reaction and the reaction to get things to normal, that's not really the response I want to see, because we are going to have a whole new way of looking at security. And people, I'm old enough to remember, I hope a lot of other Americans are, we didn't used to even have security in airports, and people complained about that. Oh, we have to go through metal detectors now, and oh, now we have to produce IDs, and oh, now we're going to have to answer these two ridiculous questions. We did it, and we all complied with it, and we got used to it, and now we have to build the airports for another threat. And I think that people saying, oh, this is going to destroy the airlines, they aren't really thinking very clearly about what we've been through.
Well, the airlines are well on their way to being destroyed by these events already. They were struggling under the weight of declining revenue, high fuel costs, just inimitable delays that were occurring. I remember particularly earlier in the spring and last winter, I mean, you couldn't get any place either out on time or arrive on time. I mean, the service was just atrocious.
That's right.
A lot of them are in financial trouble already. Now comes the total cost of this thing, the fact that airlines are cutting back. Let me talk to you, though, about security measures. I mean, it was almost as though people tried to keep from laughing out loud when one of the first things we heard after this was we weren't going to have curbside check-in anymore. Is it just me, or is there some absurdity hidden there?
That's right. There's this absurdity hidden there, and particularly, I mean, when people got to thinking about that, they realized that before, basically our terrorist check consisted of the sky caps asking us if we had packed our own bags, and the curbside check doesn't do anything to eliminate the kind of threat that we've just had or the additional threats that the FAA has considered in the past. And then the other thing that just really made us wonder if anyone in the FAA really flew is when they said they're going to ban steak knives off of airline meals. I really, I mean, I couldn't laugh because this is so tragic, but I really wondered who's in charge.
The other thing, as I understand it, airline security, it's sort of been up to the airlines up to this point. Is that true? And it was up to them to pay for it. Now, the other thing that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, not exactly. We have a piecemeal plan. The way it works is the FAA asks each airline to submit their security plan and each airport to submit their security plan, and then the FAA will approve them, and then the airline and the airport then contract out the security function to the lowest bidder. So it's, 1,000 different plans with, 1,000 different ideas how to meet it. And we have, what we have done over the past, though, is pay ticket taxes and facility charges, et cetera, that went into the Aviation Trust Fund, which was supposed to be for aviation safety and security, but we use it for things like, the nice concourses in the airport and the stores and the parking lots.
Also, the quality of the personnel themselves and how carefully they're screened and how much they're paid, and based on the compensation, the kind of individual you can attract to do that kind of work. What ought to be done with who's guarding the airports and the boarding gates now? Who ought to be doing it? How much ought they be paid? Who should do the screening? Who should take over the supervision of the airport security system in this country? The FAA doesn't seem to have done a bang-up job here.
Well, you're exactly right, and we are one of the few nations in the world that allow our airport security, which is our national security, to be literally run by a civilian contracting out agency. In most other countries, airport security is considered national security and is either run by federal law enforcement authorities or by the military. And in this case, I think that's really the only long-range viable option we have. Now, I have heard suggestions that the FAA will take back over the security function, but what really is the difference if the FAA contracts out to these low-paid screeners or if the airlines do? I think we need our own national airport security force, and in the meantime, there are ways we could handle that with current forces, but the long run, this is never going to work. It has not worked for 10 years. We had these same warnings and fears after Pan Am 103. We had these same warnings and fears and these same measures during Desert Storm, and people forget that these suggestions have been on the table for years, and we've had very real tragedies before, and we have not changed.
All right. As we move forward, some other things I'd like to talk to you about in the next hour and a half or so, things like cockpit security and why El Al, the Israeli airline, doesn't have these kinds of problems, and what a transponder is, and how come they can be turned off, and other things that I'm sure you won't have a problem with. Let's talk to Barbara in California. She has a question. Barbara?
Yes, I do have a question, but I also have a certain amount of resentment about the idea that only people of faith can join a prayer and remembrance service with President Bush. I am an atheist, and I believe there are many, many patriots who are also atheists. I am a person who believes in reason and the rule of law, and I think that that's what our founding fathers gave us. They didn't give us a religion. They gave us freedom from religion, actually, if we choose it. And I think
that's a fair comment.
I think reason will eventually prevail if we give it a chance, and I believe there's a lot of discussion going on in the government, which is reasonable. So I think we should not become fanatics to fight fanatics.
All right, Barbara, thank you for your comments. Who's next on the telephone? Susan from Indiana, what can we do for you? Or what can you do for us, maybe is a better way to say that. All right. Let me go back to Mary Schiavo. El Al Airlines has the best security in the world. Why?